We live in a culture infatuated with celebrity. It's been that way for a long time, but it has now infiltrated the Christian ranks. Christians have now fallen for celebrity worship. How? We look to Christian celebrities and cultural strongmen for leadership and validation. And we have seen many celebrity pastors, ministry leaders, and cultural icons fall from their lofty celebrity platforms because they don't have the needed spiritual maturity or accountability. On this episode of the Reintegrate podcast, we are honored to have award-winning journalist Katelyn Beaty. Her new book from Brazos Press, Celebrities for Jesus, How Personas, Platforms, and Profits Are Hurting the Church, explores the ways fame has reshaped the American church, explains how and why celebrity is woven into the fabric of the evangelical movement, and identifies many ways fame has gone awry in recent years. Thanks for joining us on the Reintegrate podcast. I'm Dr. Bob Robinson, Executive Director of Reintegrate. My co-host is David Lotney. The Reintegrate podcast is the two of us from our different generational perspectives. I'm in my 50s and David is in his 20s, discussing with nationally known authors and thought leaders how we can reintegrate our lives so that everything we think, feel, and do is cohesive with our Christian faith. Here's our interview with Katelyn Beaty. Welcome to the Reintegrate podcast, Katelyn.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you both.
We really appreciate having you on the podcast, talking about Christian subcultures, different platforms that are utilized in the church. Thinking about that, so I grew up in Ohio in a Christian subculture. Kind of fun to go back to my childhood and think like what was influencing me around that time. I always grew up in a Christian household, listening to Tim Hawkins. My parents definitely showing me DC Talk. The whole Jesus freak craze and topic. I remember buying the book at like a scholastic like book fair or something along those lines in my elementary school, listening to Toby Mac for King and Country as I got older. And it started to feel like Christianity was popular. So my mom grew up specifically in a Baptist church. And so I remember hearing a lot of like music that was fitting for their setting and for their church. But growing up, I'm like, I don't really enjoy this. And then as I got older, I was like, oh, wow, there's actual like Christian musicians that are making good music that I'm hearing on the radio. And Tim Hawkins that can do clean comedy that I enjoy. And my mom's not yelling at me to listen to these things anymore. And so thinking through all of these topics, tell us about your upbringing specifically and how you experienced the phenomenon of Christian celebrity.
Yeah, well, it sounds like we have some overlapping themes in our upbringings. I grew up in a United Methodist church in the late 90s, early 2000s. And shortly after I had committed my life to Christ, really became exposed to evangelists, authors, musicians, spokespeople who were representing the faith in the public square. And so I really attached to those figures in my own faith development. And maybe like you, there was a sense that they were cool and Christians. And so maybe I could be cool and a Christian as well. And so those celebrity figures in some ways were actually more formative for my faith identity in my teenage years than the local church that our family attended. You know, it was a seeker-sensitive, mega church, hopeful, United Methodist church, but never really was familiar with the denomination or a history that we were a part of. It was really those figures that helped solidify my faith identity. And by listening to their music and reading their books and going to see them teach at this big youth rally called Acquire the Fire in Indiana, I could lift them up or see them as heroes of the faith and kind of attach to them, even though, of course, I don't know them. We don't have a relationship. I'm getting a very mediated form of exposure to them, but that was more formative than, life in the local church. And I think that's true for a lot of people who grow up in the evangelical movement, that it's really about those individual leaders or figures or figureheads who end up being more formative than institutions and institutional life.
You define celebrity as, quote, social power without proximity. So can you flesh that out for us? You quote Andy Crouch's insight on page 18 of your book. He says, celebrity combines the old distance of power with what seems like its exact opposite, extraordinary intimacy, or at least a bewitching simulation of intimacy. Can you explain how celebrity is social power without proximity?
I distinguish celebrity from fame in that celebrity is a modern phenomenon, whereas fame, there have been famous people in all times of places, usually attached to their family lineage or military conquests or accomplishments, creativity. Right. Celebrity is a modern phenomenon in that it relies on the tools of mass media to project an image of a person that is alluring, attractive, that draws attention or affirmation, even attachment. And what Andy is helping to identify in that quote is that these tools of mass media are very powerful. They shape our hearts and minds at a deep level. We're spending a lot of time interacting with mediated other people. We are doing that right now as we record this podcast interview.
Right.
And these tools are so powerful that they can give us the impression in our hearts and minds that we know people, that we know the figures who are shaping us through their content, through their teaching, through their creative work, when in fact, in almost all cases, we don't actually know them. We're only given what they want to share with us. And it's without that proximity, and it's in the distance that mass media create, that comes all sorts of besetting temptations that comes. And this is true for other forms of power as well, that oftentimes the greater power you have, the farther distance you find yourself from other people, from kind of embodied relationship, community, forms of accountability, of truly being known, the intimacy that we all actually are made for in community. But power has a way of distancing, and then you add on the tools of media, which also have a way of distancing. And that's why I tend to think, celebrity is wreaking all sorts of havoc in the contemporary church, but it's also bad for celebrities themselves. That there can be an alone at the top dynamic in a lot of organizations with a celebrity figurehead, where they're actually very lonely and isolated. They feel like, all these people follow me, praise my preaching or my teaching, and say I'm their hero, or I brought them to faith. And yet I feel so unknown. I feel so lacking in intimacy, feeling like the more that people know me, the fewer people I can really let in a real way. So celebrity is bad for people, and it's bad
from both ways, right?
Yeah, and it's actually unkind to put people on pedestals without those proper forms of accountability, checks and balances, and real proximity.
Okay, so in the church, we have pastors who they'll throw their image up on the big screen, so they're the whole screen is their face, and they're able to they're microphoned up, and so they can speak in whispers and talk to you and really intimately, and then be really boisterous and talk extremely excited, and then lean into the camera again and say, Jesus loves you and I love you, and it's like it becomes this very. I think I know this person. I'm like really close to this person, right?
Yeah, especially when, and a lot of leaders and even celebrities outside the church do this, where they are offering us an experience of intimacy, the low talking or whispering, like it does something to our hearts and minds. I think about like mega celebrities who use Instagram to talk to their fans and show us their messy house or their beauty routine, or like now you're seeing behind the scenes, you're seeing the real me.
So I must be really close to this person.
Yeah, I think, celebrities in some ways meet a need, however falsely or unsatisfactorily meet a need for the experience of intimacy in a time when a lot of us find ourselves disconnected. We find ourselves without a deep embedded community. I'm certainly not the first one to note that we're in a lonely age. And I think these mediated forms of vulnerability, at first they meet a felt need for intimacy. Of course, they're false, right? But they speak to that need.
There's a term that you actually cite in the book called parasocial relationships, right? Instead of in-person relationships, we have gravitated to these parasocial relationships because we're so lonely. You talk about John Mulaney. I love him too. Yes. I mean, he makes me laugh so much. And then when you went through all that, you're just like, oh, my buddy, what are you doing?
Yeah, it was. So I write in the book, I am also a real fan of John Mulaney's, and I don't really get into fandom with many people. There are actors I really like or musicians, but mostly it's about their work. And John Mulaney has just managed to captivate some kind of adoration. And so as his personal life is kind of falling apart and he's going through all these changes, it was just kind of wild to see how many people, at least on the internet's like a whole subculture unto itself, were responding to the tabloid news about him as if it were happening to them. Like they felt personally disappointed that he had made certain decisions. And it's an odd dynamic of modern life that we can feel so personally invested in people who we've never met. And actually, if we met, we may not be nearly as impressed with them or taken by them as we are with their, mediated self on the stage.
Right. And so we take that's an actual celebrity who has Netflix specials and been on Saturday Night Live how many times and all this stuff. And then we take that and we bring it over to the Christian subculture, and we think we know Christian celebrities really well. And then when they fall from grace, when they do something stupid, it's like, that's very dangerous to our faith, isn't it?
Yeah, it really can be. I mean, I think, some people are able to say, after allegations or news comes out about a beloved leader, they're able to say, I know that that's not the fullness of the faith. And, the Christians I'm in relationship with in my daily life, they make faith credible to me. And I recognize, I didn't actually know Pastor so-and-so. Maybe I appreciated his sermons or whatever. But for other people, if that celebrity figure was somebody whose work or teaching actually brought you to faith, and you really came to kind of put your trust in them, God is clearly working through them and God is blessing their ministry or has put them in a position of leadership. Look at all the fruit, look at all the good things that are coming from this. It can just create such incredible cognitive dissonance and pain to learn that person, who they presented themselves to be, the faith structure of beliefs and morals and integrity they presented was so profoundly different from how they lived their life behind closed doors. You might start to wonder, well, I put my trust and faith in them. Obviously, I can't do that anymore. So is what they were teaching, does it hold any water? And I think, lots of conversations right now about deconstruction and people kind of re-examining the faith that they grew up in, kind of critically assessing what are the parts that I can hold on to? What can I let go? And I think this celebrity culture dynamic is just one more piece of the deconstruction puzzle. It's not the main thing, right, but I think it has helped to create some measure of a credibility crisis for much of the American church.
Right.
I think what also adds to that is you're also seeing pastors on social media or leaders in the church, if they're, a mega church or a larger church, now have a social media person. So, or the church in general has a social media person or a social media team. And even when you guys were discussing some of that, I was thinking of vlog culture and why that got so big on YouTube and why that still can be a big thing for TikTok and Instagram influencers, is because it's like, oh, look at a day in the life. But even that, I feel like, is a way to just allow them to see a level of vulnerability. I don't think there's like anything always wrong with that, but you can abuse that as well. I think that's just something to add in the church that I see nowadays, especially doing social media full time for my job. It's a lot of, we're going to curate this vulnerability. We're going to curate what you see online.
Well, even just going back to something that you said, David, and I don't mean to say that you should be out of a job because you work in social media, but it even strikes me that the idea that your pastor has a social media team that manages everything that they put out into that, people who have been trained to think strategically about the tools of marketing, public relations, presentation of the self. How do we manage a crisis if it occurs? Those team members just reinforce the distance between the actual person and the followers or listeners. The fact that you can't probably go directly to the pastor. If you message him or her, you're going to get a message from somebody on their team. And I know, church leaders are busy people, but I think having a team curating that just reinforces you're never getting a non-curated version of that person. I just wonder about ways in which that could be abused. And I tend to think that the pastor or leader should just be upfront that they have a team instead of presenting it as just themselves. I think they should just say, like, I have, a team helps me with all of this.
Yeah, I think those are the best case scenarios that I see from, honestly, celebrities in general, but also pastors or leaders in a church are the ones that are upfront and say, you can follow me on Instagram, but just so you know, this person, creates all my photos and makes it look nice and throws a quote up there. So when you message them, there's probably somebody else seeing it, and then they can bring it to me as needed. It's definitely a world I live in where I'm really glad that I'm friends with Bob in this scenario, because otherwise I feel like I'd be in this social media hole of like, oh, everything I do is dirty and awful, and I'm helping create this just awful algorithm and feeding it daily and all these things. But then we bring in, reintegrate into that. It's like, well, okay, but what's the beauty side of this is that we can use marketing strategies for good. There is a good side of this, but so often it is so mishandled. So I agree. I think the people that just come out and say like, hey, I have a social media team behind this. Those are the ones that I feel like have a better success rate than pretending that it's online.
Well, I'm glad that you have Bob and others to help you navigate that work. There's a cynical side of me that's tempted to say, oh, it's all dirty. Social media is bad. But of course, that's so hypocritical because I have used social media to help share the word about a book that critiques self-promotion. So it would be a little ironic, and the marketing team at the publisher that I published this book with would be dissatisfied. So I get the tension. There are days when I think, did I do this right? I don't know that I did. We don't have we don't have clear direction from how to navigate this world well, this world of platforms and promotion. And that's part of what I wanted to wrestle with in this book.
Yeah, you were honest about, you have a whole chapter basically on the evils of Christian publishing. And that's what you do for a living, right?
Yes.
And so reintegrate is like, what does it look like? The structure of Christian publishing isn't what's evil. It's what we do with it. The structure of online social media marketing isn't what's evil. It's what we do with it. Sin is never the thing. It's the actions that we do with the thing. And so that's what helps us figure this stuff out. And so, my undergrad was marketing. I'm proud of it. Okay. That's where I start. Business is good if it's done for the glory of God and done for the right reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I worked in Christian book publishing for 4 years. It is definitely a business. Book publishers by and large exist to create profit. And also working for an independent book publisher founded by Christians, by Christian businessmen in West Michigan, a company that retains a Christian identity. We have to be driven by more than the bottom line. It can't just be about making profit. There is the integration of business and mission. We understand our mission to be creating books that will nourish and enrich the church, that will help people of faith wrestle with the issues of the day. So when we're deciding which books to publish and which authors to work with, ideally that integration is on display.
That reintegrate. I'm sorry, I just have to throw in the reintegrate plug.
Self-promotion.
Well, you studied marketing, so that's you're just applying your degree. Right? Yes, reintegrating business and mission. And I argue in the book, my concern is that the pressures to create profit are so great, and the reality that celebrity sells is so apparent that I argue that a lot of Christian book publishers are contracting books that actually probably shouldn't be contracted because they're just looking at platform. They're just looking at social media numbers, maybe not even asking, can this person write a sentence? Like, are they writers? Like, can they, right. do they care about the craft of writing? Do they have an important message? Is this timely? So on and so forth. And we just get a lot of books that almost derive solely from the fact that somebody has so many followers online. And I just don't think that's how you should run a book publishing business. I'm done preaching about
off your soapbox,
the business that I work in, but
right.
If listeners are interested, I harp on it more in chapter 5 of Celebrities for Jesus.
So we as Christians, we are always seeking validation for our faith. One way we do this is what you identify as brand ambassadors, celebrities who can make Christianity look cool. I remember when Kanye West released his album, Jesus is King, and when Justin Bieber made a dramatic confession of faith in Jesus, many Christians were excited by the news because it's like, oh, great, another, Christian in mainstream media. Why are we so desperate for celebrity validation of our faith?
I think for a lot of Christians, certainly not all, but I'm thinking certainly of the faith context that I grew up in, we perceive that the cultural winds are against us, that Christians with traditional values or who feel misaligned, misunderstood in the public square are losing cultural power. They're losing the ability to shape and drive culture as they would want by their values. Certainly I grew up hearing about liberal Hollywood hating Christians, or mainstream music industry glorifying things that Christians would not approve of. And actually, I think that's probably true. There are dimensions of mainstream popular entertainment that as I get older, I feel like kind of a curmudgeon, like, oh, I think maybe my parents were right about this, even though I rebelled against it at the time. But because of that sense of losing cultural power, of not having a seat at the table, I think a lot of Christians are looking for a strong man to represent their faith in the public square, almost like if we can ensure that someone like Kanye West or Justin Bieber is sharing biblical values, is preaching the gospel, is living a Christian life, then maybe our faith will feel or be perceived to be validated, will be more acceptable, will be thought of as potentially cool. We've seen stories in recent years of mega churches that have attracted, Hollywood celebrities. There was a church like that here in New York, Hillsong, part of the Hillsong network, where, real celebrities, including Justin Bieber, were coming to the church, being escorted to a VIP section, even though Paul explicitly tells us not to do that in church.
That seems like an exact opposite of what Paul was talking about. That's very interesting.
But I think, so many of those efforts among those mega churches with like very cool pastors is to lend cultural credibility to the faith. So I don't know that seeing that Justin Bieber is reading his Bible on Instagram is going to bring you to faith, but it might make you rethink certain assumptions about what Christians are like. And if your hang up about the faith is, I don't want to be a dweeb, or I don't want to be like my grandparents, or I don't want to go to the stuffy Baptist church down the road, whatever, I can still retain a kind of cultural cachet and be a Christian. Unfortunately, I read about this in the book, and it's only gone downhill from the time that I wrote the book. The danger in kind of attaching to these celebrity figures is, of course, they could very well say and do things in the public square that later you do not want to have to defend. And I think what has happened in Kanye West's life and many of the public statements he's made, I imagine some Christians who maybe are still appreciative of his music feel like maybe we're not going to claim him as readily as we did even 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, I was even thinking that this past week. I mean, there's so many different celebrities or leaders that you can easily get behind and say, yeah. And then they do something and you're like, oh, okay. Maybe not so fast. It also just makes me think of even in the Old Testament, when Moses is coming down after writing the commandments and people have made this gold calf and all these idols. And I don't think that's left us. I mean, I think we're just finding different versions of that. And now in a digital age, it is easier now more than ever probably to have these idols. And then the moment that it disappoints us, we smash it on the ground or do whatever we need to do. And we just completely lose sight. I just remember what my mom told me when I was little. And I think it's something I'm like, wow, that's probably some of the best advice I've gotten is don't put somebody on a pedestal because you may not like who they are after you get to know them, or they'll disappoint you. Don't do that. But we still do it. And it's so difficult not to because of what's just constantly around us.
Yeah, I think that language of idolatry is really right in a lot of these cases, including in the church. Just because we're Christians and talking about Christian celebrities doesn't mean that we don't have that fallen human propensity to take a person or an object and ask them to provide for us what only God can. And I think with modern celebrity, someone I was in conversation with a few weeks ago mentioned, we're looking for touch points to the sacred. We're looking for touch points to the divine. And it's really easy to, instead of think of a Christian leader as a conduit or someone who's drawing our eyes up toward the Lord, the glory kind of rests on them instead.
Right. Because humans are icons. You talk about that in the book too. Icons in the sense that we are made in the image of God. Human beings are meant to be icons, but then we make an icon into an idol instead.
Yeah. I mean, I think about certain beloved Christian theologians or writers who I can say have enriched my faith immeasurably. And so I have an affection for them and I'm grateful for them because of the ways that God has used their work to bless me and many others. I just have to check that in my heart.
Absolutely.
Seeing God as the one who is working through them. And God as the recipient of ultimate praise and allegiance, and seeing others as conduits, seeing ourselves as conduits, but we're not the main event. We're pointing others to the main event.
Yeah, in the book, you helpfully identify 3 temptations that come from the celebrity mindset that can hurt the church. The first is abusing power. Power is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Those with power can use it for the purpose of helping others flourish. Good leadership, as Andy Crouch says in his book, and by the way, Andy Crouch, I have a man crush on Andy Crouch. I mean, this guy is amazing. I love this guy, but why? Because he points me to Christ over and over and over again. But Andy Crouch, In his book, Strongmen Week, he says, good leadership begins the moment you are concerned more about others flourishing than you are about your own. What you write in this book in excellent reporter fashion, by the way. You set your sources. It's just so well done. But you write about Mark Driscoll of Mars Hill Church, Carl Lentz of Hillsong NYC, comedian John Christ, Ravi Zacharias, and how RZIM failed to hold him accountable. So how did their celebrity become idolization that led to their abuses of power?
Yeah, well, in each of those cases, I'm sure the story unfolded in slightly different ways. And I genuinely believe that, at least in some of those cases, the leader at least entered into ministry with really good motives. That I kind of doubt that, well, I don't know. Who's to say? Based on what I have heard and understood about the early days of Mars Hill, Mark Driscoll's church in Seattle,
right?
There was a pure motive. There was a pure, yes, he was brash and crass and all of that, but, there was a real desire to bring people to the church and see them have an encounter with Jesus and to be discipled. I think something happens to all of us when we have the experience of having others look to us as being an infallible expert, as being a mouthpiece for God. Sometimes, people will confuse your leadership and God's leading and kind of conflate the two. And so it becomes difficult to ask questions or even, disagree or critique if you're in a church culture where honor has turned into kind of unquestioning loyalty. I think some of this is we want to feel important. We want to feel special. We want to feel on mission. And if you are a very charismatic, dynamic leader that people are pointing to say, you are so much a part of our success when you preach, when you teach, more people come. The church is growing because of your leadership. The ministry's raising millions of dollars because of your leadership. That is going to go to your head unless you very intentionally say, I am not going to let this go to my head. And one way I'm going to do that is to submit to accountability really early on, or create rules or metrics where I am not going to start believing my own hype. And I think in all of those cases, at the moment where there should have been resistance early on, there was instead, no, this is fine, because it's all for God's glory. It's all for the church growing.
Right.
We're on the train. It's heading towards success. So I don't want to stop the train. And plus, this makes me feel good. It makes me feel good to be in charge or to have others see me as really important.
You start believing that your mission is so important, and your vision for the mission is so important that you surround yourself with people who also agree that your mission is important and your vision for the mission is important. So a bunch of yes men around you doesn't help you hold yourself accountable.
Surrounding yourself with yes men is like the opposite of accountability.
Maybe.
It is more like a consolidation of power, right? Except that it's now kind of codified and systematized through the appearance of accountability structure. So
Mark Driscoll did that. Bill Hybels did that. They surrounded themselves with elder boards that they said, I'm accountable to this elder board, but everybody on the elder board was vetted by the pastor to be his people.
Yeah. And I would love to hear an expert on church polity speak to how elder boards are supposed to be selected, but I have to think that it should not be up to the lead pastor to say, I want you. Like, again, that all of us need people in our lives, and especially any of us who are in a position of leadership. We need people in our lives who can freely speak the truth in love and say the hard word if need be, and can see our blind spots, and who are able to articulate that without fear of retaliation. And I think, as you just mentioned, Bob, at least with Driscoll and Hybels, it seems like they very intentionally wanted people who would not offer that. They didn't want people who would slow down the success train, who would slow down their mission for the church, their desire to grow and build. So
And institutions can feed into the problem itself. And so with Ravi Zacharias, RZIM, Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, they had to repent and confess that they were complicit, that they were not set up well to hold him accountable to his lifestyle, right?
That story was really hard to learn about. But after this independent investigation, I really respected that leaders at RZIM expressed corporate repentance. I don't think that you see that very much. I think it's kind of easier to say, well, obviously this person, this individual had a lot of problems that we failed to see, but just seeing that an institution can become complicit in abuses of power. If they're not asking hard questions, if they're not offering accountability, if they're, showing loyalty to the leader and not showing interest in what, alleged victims are claiming, that's where, institutions in a lot of these cases also are called to repentance. It's not just the individual.
So I see a lot of young people turning away from the evangelical faith because of a lot of issues that are coming to the surface, right? As you reported on these things as a Christian journalist, and as you've experienced these things up close and personal in your career in publishing, I can imagine you're becoming pretty cynical about it all. But you, Katelyn, you have kept the faith. Why? What is it about Christianity and about this Jesus Christ himself that keeps you tethered to the faith?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I should preface this by saying I'm still sometimes cynical. And that is something I have to ask the Lord to sanctify in myself, especially when I see the headlines. So that is just, I think it comes with the territory of journalism, and it's just kind of my bent. But it's a great question. I mean, what keeps me continuing to find not just Christianity, but the person of Christ compelling is that as we read about the life and person of Jesus in scripture, he's so not like these fallen leaders. There are so many points at which Jesus could have clung to power, even to try to do good things. And you see this relinquishing, this pouring out. Jesus was willing to associate with people who would not have helped his social standing. In fact, would have definitely harmed his social standing, including women, but also people with various infirmities, disabilities, people who are outcasts. Like, if you're just in it for clout, he was not doing it right. We read that he frequently went away from the crowds. There were crowds following him. He had people really interested in what he was doing. They wanted to see the spectacle, but he seemed to practice a kind of detachment from that, to kind of reorient himself to his relationship with the Father. Of course, the crucifixion is just this ultimate pouring out of power on behalf of others. So I find Jesus to be the best repudiation of so many of the dynamics that we see in the contemporary church. And then I will also say, and I write about this in the book, I think about people like my parents and friends who I've had for years who are not really on social media. They don't have a platform. They're not flashy or seemingly important people in the world's eyes, but their commitment to a kind of ordinary faithfulness, to loving and serving God and others simply because it's the right thing to do. It's the obedient thing to do, regardless of outcomes or success. Like, that really matters. That's so much of what keeps the world from falling apart. So my parents, Tim and Karen, they have been at the church that I grew up in for 30 years and have been married for over 40 years, have lived in the same 3-bedroom ranch for over 30 years. Like, they're very salt of the earth people. Nice. And it's like, I think the older I get, I grew up thinking that I needed to do big things for God, and like the bigger, the better, and the flashier, the better. And the older I get, I think how Tim and Karen live is actually where it's at.
I mean, that's fascinating because, I do college ministry. My day job is to work with college students, and they all want to change the world themselves. They don't think small. They don't think ordinary. And it's like, so I'm constantly going back to mustard seed. It's the mustard seed that builds the kingdom. It's not the huge things you do. It's all of us doing our mustard seed, just caring, loving the people around us and serving the people around us, and not getting a platform so you can make the world a better place through this huge change that you think you're going to make.
I mean, you're preaching to the choir, but I remember, I mean, of course I remember what it was like to be a college student. I went to Calvin University, so very excited about Christian integration of life and faith, and probably went into Christian publishing in part because of that. But I just think about the ways that people actually change, and it really does. It really starts with relationship. It really starts with embodied relationship. And there's no way to say that without sounding like a cliche. But there are so many people online who I follow, I appreciate. But at the end of the day, like the thing that I remember, the thing that is most precious to me and that has most changed and shaped me are the few core relationships in my life with people who love Jesus. That's the thing that I will point to.
I was thinking from a social media perspective, Jesus had the 12 followers, and that's awful compared to analytics. I mean, if you're looking at it strategically,
it's really bad
like,
numbers.
Jesus, like you have awful analytics, but your message is great. But
we love the message, love the vision, but like you really need help.
You really got to go more live on Instagram, and you got to be at these places.
I can see Judas as the social media.
He was a social media man. What does that say about me, Bob? No, I'm just kidding. But it did make me think in a way, like it's almost like thank goodness Jesus wasn't worried about clout, and thank goodness that we serve a Savior that wasn't selling tickets for a sermon and then pocketing the money and doing all of these things. It's like it's just beautiful that we serve somebody that served his creation so well. And that is the difference. Ultimately, it comes down to that. It also just makes me think of a quote that I heard from the Jubilee conference with CCO. Because I remember going to this Jubilee conference, and I was one of those students where I was like, I want to be known, you have that desire, and you're like, I'm going to change the world. And I just remember so many conversations at Jubilee where it's like, start small. Like, you want to change the world, go home and love your family and start there. And I probably have said this quote on this podcast before, but it's just one that sticks with me is I heard a speaker say, may your life be interesting and your Instagram be boring. And that just hit me. I remember sitting there because I was thinking, how many times do we get it the opposite way of we're trying so hard to make our Instagram so interesting, and then our life is, it's not like it's not interesting, but where's the quality? And I think that's what it comes down to, is the quality of life you're living versus presenting on Instagram or wherever. So it's just something that as Christians, especially, but just anybody, you have to keep that in mind.
Yeah. Especially given the addictive nature of social media, which everyone in Silicon Valley who was responsible for bringing this into our lives will now say, oh, we have created something far more damaging than we expected. We don't let our own children use these devices. So I have to ask too, I am on social media, but is it drawing me away? Is it pulling me away in my time and attention and energy from real relationship? And if so, what's going on there? And how do we mitigate that? Because it's not just an individual problem, it's a collective problem too.
Well, thank you for joining us tonight, Katelyn. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And people should check out the book, Celebrities for Jesus. It's one of the best reads I've had for a long time.
Thank you. Thanks to you both, Bob and David, for a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Katelyn.